The bitter wind howled across the frozen St. Lawrence River as Colonel Benedict Arnold pressed his frostbitten hand against the stone wall, peering through the swirling snow. At the imposing fortress of Quebec City, it was December 30th, 1775, and the American Continental Army stood on the precipice of what would either be their greatest triumph or most catastrophic defeat in the northern theater of the Revolutionary War. Arnold's eyes, hardying, deep by months of grueling wilderness march, traced the massive stone ramparts that had protected this strategic gateway to Canada. For over a century, behind those walls lay not just British soldiers, but the dreams of American independence in the north. The capture of Quebec would mean controlling the entire St. Lawrence corridor, cutting off British supply lines and potentially bringing French-Canadian inhabitants into the revolutionary fold. The journey to this moment had been nothing short of extraordinary. Arnold had led his men through the treacherous Maine wilderness, following ancient Indian trails and navigating rivers that seemed determined to claim American lives at every turn. Of the original 1,100 men who had departed Cambridge in September, barely 700 remained, their ranks thinned by disease, desertion, and the merciless Canadian winter died now. As Arnold waited in the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear the muffled sounds of his compatriot, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery, positioning his forces on the opposite side of the city. Montgomery, the Irish-born former British officer who had thrown his lot in with the American cause, commanded the respect of both his men and his enemies. His recent capture of Montreal had proven that British strongholds in Canada were not invincible, giving hope to the revolutionary cause when hope was desperately needed. The plan they had devised was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. With the fortress too strong for a direct assault and their artillery too light to breach the walls, they would strike during a blizzard, using the cover of snow and darkness to penetrate the lower town through the separate routes. Montgomery would lead his New York troops along the river route from the southwest, while Arnold would advance his New England men from the northeast, converging on the heart of Quebec's commercial district before fighting their way up to the upper town. Inside the fortress, British General Guy Carleton had been expecting this moment for weeks. The veteran commander, who had served with distinction in numerous campaigns, understood the desperation that drove the American forces. Winter was their enemy as much as the British garrison, and every day that passed without action meant more American soldiers would succumb to cold, hunger, and disease. According to historical accounts documented in the Quebec Gazette archives, Carleton had approximately 1,800 defenders at his disposal, including British regulars, Canadian, militia, and loyal inhabitants who had taken up arms to defend their city. The walls themselves were formidable, built to withstand both European siege warfare and the harsh Canadian climate, with strategic positions commanding every approach to the fortress. As the blizzard intensified, both armies prepared for a battle that would determine not just the fate of Quebec, but potentially the entire northern campaign of the American Revolution. The stakes could not have been higher, and both sides understood that dawn would bring either liberation or catastrophe. In the swirling snow and bitter cold, destiny itself seemed to hang in the balance, waiting for the first shots to be fired in what would become one of the most decisive and tragic encounters of the revolutionary struggle. The weeks leading to this fateful assault had been marked by a series of calculated risks and desperate gambles that brought the American forces to Quebec's gates. Richard Montgomery's capture of Montreal in November 1775 had sent shockwaves through British North America, proving that the rebellion had spread far beyond the 13 colonies and now threatened the very heart of British power in Canada. Montgomery, a tall, aristocratic figure whose military bearing commanded instant respect, had joined the American cause despite his British origins and previous service in His Majesty's Army. His decision to rebel against his former allegiance had been born from conviction rather than opportunism, and his leadership had already proven invaluable to the Continental cause. The Irish-born general possessed the rare combination of tactical brilliance and personal charisma that inspired men to follow him into seemingly impossible situations. Meanwhile, Arnold's march through the Maine wilderness had become the stuff of legend even before its completion, leading his men through the Quebec River Valley and across the height of land into Canada. Arnold had navigated treacherous rapids, dense forests, and swamps that seemed designed to swallow entire armies. His men had survived on dried meat, flour soup, and sheer determination, with some companies resorting to eating their leather equipment when rations ran out completely. The convergence of these two forces outside Quebec represented the culmination of months of planning by the Continental Congress and its military leadership. General George Washington himself had endorsed the Northern Campaign, recognizing that success in Canada could fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the war. Control of the St. Lawrence River system would not only deny the British a crucial supply route, but also potentially bring thousands of French-Canadian inhabitants into the American fold. Inside Quebec, General Carleton faced his own set of challenges. The British garrison was outnumbered, and many of the local inhabitants remained neutral at best, with some actively sympathizing with the American cause. Carleton, a veteran of the 7 Years' War who had served with distinction at the Plains of Abraham, understood that his defense would need to rely on the strength of Quebec's fortifications, rather than the size of his garrison. The city itself was a fortress within a fortress, its stone walls rising dramatically from the cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence. The upper town, perched on Cap Diamond, commanded sweeping views of the surrounding countryside and river approaches. The lower town, pressed between the cliff face and the river, contained the commercial heart of the city, but was vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. As December waned, both sides engaged in a careful dance of preparation and intelligence gathering. American agents moved through the surrounding countryside, attempting to gauge local sentiment and identify potential routes of attack. British patrols probed American positions, seeking to understand the true strength and intentions of the besieging force. Historical records from the British Colonial Office, as preserved in the National Archives, revealed that Carleton had received intelligence reports suggesting the Americans were planning a winter assault rather than waiting for spring reinforcements. This intelligence would prove remarkably accurate, though it would not prevent the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The weather became a crucial factor in both armies' calculations. The harsh Canadian winter that was slowly decimating American ranks also provided the cover necessary for any assault on the fortress. A major blizzard would reduce visibility to mere yards, potentially allowing attacking forces to approach the walls undetected while simultaneously making defensive coordination nearly impossible. As the year 1775 drew to a close, both Montgomery and Arnold knew that time was running out. Their men were dying from cold and disease at an alarming rate, and spring would bring British reinforcements that would make any assault impossible. The decision to attack had been made not just by military calculation, but by the harsh mathematics of survival itself. On the morning of December 31st, 1775, the long-awaited blizzard finally arrived with a fury that seemed to match the desperation of the American cause. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, driven by winds that cut through even the heaviest winter clothing and reduced visibility to mere feet. For Montgomery and Arnold, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Nature herself had provided the cover they needed for their audacious assault on the Gibraltar of North America. The final war council had been held just hours before in a cramped farmhouse outside the city walls. Montgomery, his aristocratic features etched with the strain of command, had reviewed the plan one final time with his subordinate officers. The assault would begin in the pre-dawn hours of January 1st, 1776, with both columns moving simultaneously to prevent the British from concentrating their defense against either attack. Arnold, despite nursing a leg wound from a recent skirmish, insisted on leading his column personally. His New England troops, hardened by their epic wilderness march, looked to him not just as a commander, but as a symbol of American determination. These men had already achieved the impossible by reaching Quebec alive. Now they prepared to attempt something even more extraordinary. The two assault columns would strike at opposite ends of the lower town, with Montgomery approaching along the narrow path between the cliffs and the river from Prestville, while Arnold would advance through the Saltomatella district from the northeast. Once both forces had secured their initial objectives, they would link up in the heart of the lower town before launching a coordinated assault on the barriers leading to the upper town. Inside Quebec, General Carleton had not been idle. The veteran commander had positioned his limited forces with the skill of a master chess player, placing his most reliable troops at key defensive positions, while ensuring that civilian militia units were supported by regular soldiers. The general understood that the coming battle would likely determine not just the fate of Quebec, but potentially the entire British position in North America. The British defenses had been carefully prepared for exactly this type of assault. Barriers had been constructed across the narrow streets of the lower town, each one designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones, where concentrated musket fire could devastate entire companies. Artillery pieces had been positioned to sweep the approaches, while reserves waited in the upper town, ready to reinforce any threatened sector. As the storm intensified, both armies made their final preparations. American soldiers checked their weapons repeatedly, knowing that wet powder could mean the difference between victory and death. Many wrote final letters to loved ones, understanding that they might not survive to see the dawn of the new year. The weight of history pressed down upon them all. They were about to attempt something that could change the course of the Revolutionary War. Montgomery's column consisted primarily of New York troops who had proven their mettle during the Montreal campaign. These men had developed a fierce loyalty to their general, who had shared their hardships and led from the front in every engagement. They trusted his judgment completely, even as they prepared to follow him into what many privately believed might be a suicide mission. Arnold's force contained many of the survivors of the legendary march through Maine, men who had already endured more hardship than most soldiers face in entire careers. Their faces bore the marks of frostbite and exhaustion, but their eyes still burned with the determination that had carried them across hundreds of miles of wilderness. They had not come this far to turn back now. Contemporary accounts from the Massachusetts Historical Society archives describe the eerie quiet that settled over the American camps as the final hours approached. Men who had been joking and singing just days before now sat in contemplative silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what the coming battle might bring. The signal for the assault would be a rocket fired into the stormy sky, visible to both columns despite the blizzard. Once that flare illuminated the darkness, there would be no turning back. The fate of Quebec, and perhaps of the entire American cause in the North, would be decided in the narrow, snow-filled streets of the lower town, where the armies would clash in one of the most desperate and decisive battles of the Revolutionary War. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning on January 1st, 1776, the signal rocket burst through the swirling snow above Quebec, its red glare briefly illuminating the fortress walls before disappearing into the storm. In that moment, over 1,000 American soldiers began their advance through the blizzard toward what they hoped would be victory, but what history would record as one of the Revolutionary War's most tragic defeats. Montgomery's column moved first, creeping along the treacherous path between the cliff face and the icy St. Lawrence River. The general himself led from the front, his tall figure barely visible through the driving snow as he guided his New York troops toward their objective at Prestville. The narrow path forced his men into single file, making them vulnerable, but also harder for British sentries to detect in the storm's fury. The approach was more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Ice covered every surface, making each step treacherous, while the wind-driven snow stung exposed skin and made breathing difficult. Equipment became encrusted with ice, and many soldiers found their weapons difficult to handle with numbed fingers. Yet Montgomery pressed forward, knowing that hesitation now would doom the entire enterprise. Simultaneously, Arnold's column advanced through the Salto-Metella district, their progress marked by the soft crunch of snow under hundreds of feet and the occasional clatter of equipment against stone walls. Arnold, despite his wounded leg, maintained a pace that pushed his men to their limits. These veterans of the Maine Wilderness March understood that speed and surprise were their only advantages against the well-fortified defenders inside Quebec. British sentries strained their eyes through the blizzard, knowing that an attack was imminent, but unable to see more than a few yards in any direction. General Carleton had positioned his men at key defensive points, but the storm that aided the American approach also made communication between defensive positions nearly impossible. The fate of the city would depend on the individual courage and quick thinking of isolated groups of defenders. The first contact came at Prestville, where Montgomery's advance guard encountered a British outpost guarding the approach to the lower town. The engagement was brief but violent, with musket flashes illuminating the snow-filled air like deadly lightning. Montgomery himself pressed forward with his leading elements, determined to maintain momentum despite the fierce resistance. It was here that disaster struck the American cause with devastating suddenness. As Montgomery led a charge against the first British barrier, a well-positioned cannon loaded with grape shot swept the narrow approach. The Irish-born general, who had inspired such confidence in his men and hope in the American cause, fell mortally wounded in the first volley, his life's blood staining the pristine snow. News of Montgomery's fall spread through his column like wildfire. Despite the storm and confusion of battle, the New York troops, who had followed their beloved commander from Montreal to the gates of Quebec, suddenly found themselves leaderless in the face of determined British resistance. Without Montgomery's inspirational leadership, the assault began to falter almost immediately. Historical records from the Crown Collection, as maintained by Library and Archives Canada, document that the British defenders at Presqu'Île were commanded by Captain Hugh McKinnon, a Scottish officer whose quick thinking and accurate artillery fire had eliminated the most dangerous threat to Quebec's defenses. McKinnon's men continued to pour devastating fire into the American ranks, turning the narrow approach into a killing ground. Meanwhile, Arnold's column had achieved initial success in penetrating the outer defenses of the Saltomatella district. The New England troops, driven by months of hardship and their commander's indomitable will, had overwhelmed the first British positions and were advancing deeper into the lower town. For a brief moment, it seemed that at least one prong of the American assault might succeed. Arnold himself was among the first to breach the British lines, his sword flashing in the dim light as he led his men forward. But as the column pressed deeper into the maze of narrow streets, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance. British and Canadian defenders, fighting for their homes and families, contested every building and barricade with desperate courage. Then, in a moment that would forever alter the course of the battle, Arnold fell with a severe leg wound, a British musket ball shattering bone and ending his personal participation in the assault. As their commander was carried to safety, his men found themselves deep within enemy territory, cut off from retreat and facing an increasingly organized defensive response. The storm that had initially favored the attackers now began to work against them, as wet snow rendered many American weapons useless while the defenders, fighting from covered positions, maintained their rate of fire. The tide of battle was turning, and both sides knew it. With both Montgomery dead and Arnold severely wounded within the first hour of the assault, the American attack began to lose coherence just as the British defense was gaining strength. Captain Daniel Morgan, the legendary frontiersman who had led Arnold's advance guard, now found himself effectively commanding the northern prong of the assault as it penetrated deeper into the maze of Quebec's lower town. Morgan's men, the cream of Arnold's wilderness veterans, had successfully breached the first line of British defenses and were advancing through the narrow streets of Saltomatella. These hardened soldiers, many of them expert marksmen from the Virginia and Pennsylvania frontier, pressed forward with a determination born of months of suffering and sacrifice. They had not endured the horrors of the Maine wilderness march to be stopped by stone walls and winter weather. The fighting in the narrow streets was unlike anything most of these men had experienced. Buildings rose on either side like canyon walls, channeling the attackers into killing zones where British defenders could pour fire down from windows and rooftops. Every intersection became a battlefield, every doorway a potential ambush point. The Americans, trained in woodland warfare, found themselves at a severe disadvantage in this urban environment. General Carleton, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in the upper town, quickly grasped the tactical situation. While Montgomery's death had effectively ended the southern assault, Arnold's men remained a serious threat if they could link up with any surviving elements. From the Presqu'Île attack, the British commander began shifting his reserves to contain and eliminate the American penetration before it could consolidate its gains. The weather continued to play a crucial role in the unfolding disaster. What had begun as the Americans' ally had become their enemy. As the blizzard made coordination between scattered units nearly impossible, men became separated from their companies in the swirling snow, and officers found it impossible to maintain control over their formations. The carefully planned assault was degenerating into a series of isolated, desperate fights. Captain Morgan, realizing that his position was becoming untenable, attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal, but the same narrow streets that had channeled his advance now trapped his men in a deadly maze. British reinforcements were arriving from multiple directions, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed off stone walls from every quarter. The turning point came when Captain Laws, commanding a company of British Marines, led a flanking movement that cut off the American line of retreat. Suddenly, Morgan's men found themselves surrounded, caught between converging British forces with no avenue of escape. The trap that Carleton had carefully prepared was finally springing shut. On the surviving American attackers, contemporary accounts, preserved in the archives of the Chateau Ramezay Museum, describe the fierce hand-to-hand fighting that erupted as the Americans realized their desperate situation. Morgan himself, a giant of a man whose exploits had already become legendary on the American frontier, fought with the fury of a cornered bear, his rifle and tomahawk claiming several British lives before he was finally overwhelmed. The end came with startling suddenness. One moment the Americans were fighting desperately for their lives. The next they found themselves surrounded by more British soldiers than they had bullets remaining. Morgan, blood streaming from multiple wounds, looked around at his surviving men and made the hardest decision of his military career. Rather than see his men slaughtered to no purpose, he surrendered his sword to Captain Laws. The capture of Morgan and his men effectively ended the American assault on Quebec. In the span of just a few hours, the Continental Army had lost its senior commanders and seen its elite troops either killed or captured. The dream of bringing Canada into the American Union lay buried in the snow-covered streets of the lower town, along with the bodies of men who had sacrificed everything for the cause of independence. Back at the American camps outside the city, the survivors struggled to make sense of the disaster that had befallen them. Units that had marched confidently into battle just hours before were now streaming back in disorder, their ranks decimated and their morale shattered. The men who had endured so much to reach this moment now faced the bitter reality that their sacrifice had been in vain. News of the defeat spread quickly through the remaining American forces, carried by wounded men and stragglers who had escaped the carnage in the lower town. The magnitude of the disaster became clear as roll calls revealed the true cost of the failed assault. Hundreds of men were missing, either dead in the snow-filled streets or prisoners in British hands. The new year that had dawned with such hope for the American cause in the North had instead brought crushing defeat, and the effective end of the Canadian campaign. The Gibraltar of North America had held, and with it, British control of the St. Lawrence River system and the gateway to the continent's interior. Dawn on January 1st, 1776, revealed the full extent of the American catastrophe. At Quebec, as the blizzard finally began to subside, British patrols ventured out from the fortress to survey the battlefield and account for their victory. What they found in the snow-covered streets of the lower town was a scene of devastation that would be seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. The body of Richard Montgomery lay where he had fallen at Prestéville, his aristocratic features peaceful in death despite the violence of his final moments. The Irish-born general, who had sacrificed his British commission for the American cause, had paid the ultimate price for his convictions. British officers, many of whom had known Montgomery during his previous service in His Majesty's army, viewed his corpse with a mixture of professional respect and personal sadness. General Carleton, displaying the chivalrous conduct that had marked his entire military career, ordered that Montgomery's body be treated with full military honors. The British commander understood that his fallen adversary had been a man of principle, who had acted according to his conscience. Even if that conscience had led him to rebellion against the crown, Montgomery would be buried with dignity befitting his rank and sacrifice. The prisoners taken during the assault presented Carleton with both an opportunity and a problem. Captain Daniel Morgan and his men represented some of the finest soldiers in the Continental Army, veterans whose capture was a significant blow to American military capabilities. Yet these same men had to be fed, housed, and guarded at a time when Quebec's resources were already stretched thin by the ongoing siege. Morgan himself, nursing multiple wounds from his final desperate fight, maintained his dignity even in captivity. The legendary frontiersman had earned the respect of his captors through his courage and leadership during the assault, and British officers found themselves impressed by both his military bearing and his refusal to be broken by defeat. His men, following their commander's example, conducted themselves as soldiers rather than criminals. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, despite his severe leg wound, refused to abandon the siege entirely. From his sick bed in a farmhouse outside Quebec's walls, the Connecticut colonel struggled to maintain what remained of American military presence in the region. His wound was serious enough to end his active participation in the campaign, but his determination to continue the fight remained undiminished. The surviving American forces found themselves in an increasingly precarious position, with Montgomery dead and Arnold incapacitated. Command devolved to officers who lacked both the experience and the charisma to hold together an army that was already dissolving from cold, disease, and demoralization. Desertion rates soared as men began to realize that the Canadian expedition had become a death trap. Supply problems, already critical before the assault, became insurmountable in its aftermath. The Continental Congress had promised reinforcements and provisions, but winter weather made transportation nearly impossible, and the military disaster at Quebec made it unlikely that significant resources would be committed to what was increasingly seen as a lost cause, local support, which American leaders had hoped would materialize once they demonstrated their ability to challenge British power, failed to develop as expected. Many French-Canadian inhabitants, while not necessarily loyal to the British Crown, were unwilling to risk their lives and property for a cause that seemed doomed to failure. The American defeat had demonstrated that British power in Canada remained formidable. Historical documentation from the Séminaire de Québec archives reveals that the civilian population of Quebec had endured the siege with considerable hardship, but had never wavered in their determination to resist American occupation. The failed assault vindicated their faith in British protection and strengthened loyalist sentiment throughout the region. Arnold's attempts to maintain the siege through the winter of 1776 became increasingly desperate as his force dwindled from casualties, disease, and desertion. Smallpox proved particularly devastating, killing more Americans than British bullets had managed during the assault. The Dream Army that had begun the Canadian campaign with such high hopes had become a collection of sick, demoralized men barely capable of maintaining their own existence. The strategic implications of the Quebec disaster extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The failure to capture Canada meant that the British retained a secure base from which to launch operations against the Northern American colonies. The St. Lawrence River system remained under British control, providing a crucial supply route that would prove vital in subsequent campaigns. Perhaps most significantly, the defeat at Quebec marked the end of American hopes for expanding the Revolution. Beyond the 13 original colonies, Canada would remain British, and with it, the dream of a continental union that might have changed the entire character of North American development. The failure at Quebec's gates had consequences that would echo through centuries of Canadian American relations. As winter deepened and the American position became increasingly untenable, it became clear that the Northern campaign had become a costly failure that had consumed some of the Continental Army's best officers and men, while achieving none of its strategic objectives. The final withdrawal of American forces from Quebec came not with a dramatic flourish of military defeat, but with the slow, grinding reality of an army consuming itself through disease, desertion, and despair. By spring of 1776, what remained of the once proud Continental force that had marched on Quebec had become a shadow of its former self, retreating southward in stages as British reinforcements arrived with the opening of navigation on the St. Lawrence. Benedict Arnold, his legs still healing from his New Year's Day wound, supervised much of this retreat with characteristic determination. Despite the magnitude of the disaster and his own physical limitations, Arnold refused to accept complete defeat. He understood better than most that the failure at Quebec represented more than just a tactical setback. It marked the end of American dreams for continental union and left the northern colonies vulnerable to British attack. From Canadian bases, the human cost of the Quebec campaign had been staggering. Beyond the immediate casualties from the failed assault, disease had ravaged the American ranks throughout the winter siege. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery had killed more Continental soldiers than British muskets and cannons combined. Entire companies had simply melted away, their men either dead, deserted, or too sick to continue service. General Carleton, for his part, had proven himself to be both a capable defender and a magnanimous victor. His treatment of American prisoners and wounded had been exemplary by 18th century standards, earning him respect even from his enemies. The British commander understood that harsh treatment of captives would only inflame American resentment and make future reconciliation more difficult. The psychological impact of the Quebec defeat reverberated throughout the American colonies and beyond. Richard Montgomery had been one of the Revolution's most promising generals, a man whose military experience and aristocratic background had lent credibility to the American cause. His death at Quebec represented not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of the enormous risks inherent in the revolutionary enterprise. Captain Daniel Morgan's capture had deprived the Continental Army of one of its most effective combat leaders. The frontiersman's reputation had made him a legendary figure among American troops, and his absence would be felt in subsequent campaigns. British officials recognized Morgan's value and treated him with the respect to a formidable adversary, but his imprisonment removed a key piece from the American military chessboard. The failure to bring Canada into the American Union had profound, long-term consequences for the development of North America. Had Quebec fallen and Canada joined the Revolution, the entire subsequent history of the continent might have been different. Instead, Canada remained British, providing a refuge for loyalists and a base for future British operations against the rebellious colonies. The strategic lessons of Quebec were not lost on either side. For the Americans, the disaster demonstrated the dangers of overextension and the importance of adequate supply lines. The Continental Congress would be more cautious about approving ambitious campaigns that stretched limited resources beyond their breaking point. For the British, Quebec proved that determined defense of key strongholds could blunt American offensive capabilities and maintain Crown authority in critical regions. Benedict Arnold's role in the Quebec campaign added another chapter to what was already becoming a complex and controversial military career. His leadership during the march through Maine had been exemplary, and his courage during the assault was unquestioned. Yet seeds of the resentment that would later lead to his treason may have been planted during these difficult months, as Arnold felt his contributions were underappreciated by Congress and his superiors. The memory of Quebec would haunt both Montgomery and Arnold in different ways. Montgomery's death made him a martyr to the American cause, his name invoked alongside other revolutionary heroes who had given their lives for independence. Arnold's survival and continued service would eventually lead to infamy when he turned traitor, casting a shadow over his earlier heroism at Quebec and elsewhere. Contemporary accounts from both British and American sources, as preserved in collections such as those at the William L. Clements Library, emphasize how close the assault came to success despite its ultimate failure. Had Montgomery survived the initial engagement, or had Arnold not been wounded at the crucial moment, the battle might have had a very different outcome. The failed assault on Quebec City on January 1st, 1776, stands as one of the Revolutionary War's most dramatic and consequential defeats. It marked the end of American hopes for expanding the Revolution beyond the 13 colonies, and demonstrated the limits of continental military power. The brave men who died in Quebec's snow-covered streets had written their names in history, even as their cause met defeat at the Gibraltar of North America. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten, but neither would the harsh lesson that courage alone could not always overcome prepared defenses, superior numbers, and the unforgiving Canadian winter. The dream of a continental American Union died with Richard Montgomery in the narrow streets of Quebec's lower town, leaving a legacy that would shape North American development for centuries to come.